The roar came first. Not a crackle, a roar. The old hay barn was eating itself alive, and somewhere inside it was the man who had gone in after a piece of paper. Eleanor Vance was already running before she understood why. Smoke does not smell like danger at first. It smells like supper left too long on the stove, like a chimney drawing wrong on a windy night. That is what she told herself in the first 3 seconds, standing in the yard with a bucket half raised. Then the sound reached her, and there was no mistaking it for anything but what it was. Eleanor Vance stood 6 feet and 4 inches in her stocking feet. She had spent every year of her life being measured against doorways, against dress patterns, against the width of other people's expectations, and every year she had come up too much. Too tall, too broad in the shoulder, too big, plain and simple, for anything a decent town was willing to hand her. Tonight the doorway she measured herself against was a burning one, and for the first time in her life, too big was exactly the right size. She went in. What she carried out of that barn, both of the things she carried out of that barn, would still be spoken of in that valley long after the ash had cooled and the fences had been rebuilt twice over. But to understand why a woman that size was standing in that fire at all, you have to go back 4 months, to a dressmaker's shop with a bolt of white silk nobody in town was willing to cut. If you have ever been told, gently or cruelly, that you were simply too much for the plans other people had already made, this one is for you. Subscribe if you want more of these long frontier stories, and tell me in the comments what town you're watching from tonight. The dressmaker's shop on Larkin Street smelled of chalk dust and lavender water, and Mrs. Prairie had been folding the same bolt of ivory silk for 11 minutes before she finally spoke. "I don't have a pattern that will do it, Eleanor," she said. "I've cut for every woman in this county. I don't have one for you." The 2 women pretending to examine ribbon by the window did not look up. They did not need to. Eleanor had felt their eyes on her the moment she'd walked in, the way she felt eyes on her most places, assessing, sizing, deciding. "I brought my own measurements," Eleanor said. "I can bring more silk if the yardage runs short." "It isn't the yardage." Mrs. Prairie would not meet her eyes. "It's the shape of you. I don't know how to make lace sit right on shoulders like." She stopped herself. "I'm sorry. I can't take the commission." Eleanor thanked her, which cost her more than the silk would have, and walked out onto Larkin Street with her spine straight, because a woman her size did not have the luxury of walking any other way. 2 men outside the feed store laughed before she'd gone 20 paces. She did not turn to see if it was at her. By sunset she had made a private decision, the kind a person makes alone in a kitchen with no one to argue them out of it. She would not stand in front of another mirror wearing white. Not because she didn't want a wedding, because she was tired of wanting one in a town that had already decided what her wanting looked like. 3 days later, a stranger rode in asking about a wife. He didn't ask at the dress shop. He asked at the feed store, of all places, where Eleanor had gone to buy nails for the porch step her father used to fix before his hands gave out. The stranger was lean and sun-cured, maybe 35, with a gray gelding that had seen hard use and a coat that had been mended more than once by somebody without much skill at mending. "Name's Levi Carter," he said, when the feed store owner pointed her out to him. Not unkindly, just practically, the way you'd point out the one person in town who could lift a wagon wheel off a stuck axle. "I hear you're strong." "I hear a lot of things get said about me," Eleanor answered. "Not all of them true." "I need a wife who can rebuild a ranch," he said. "Not a wife who looks fine standing beside a rebuilt one. There's a difference, and I mean to be honest about which one I'm asking for." He did not ask her size. He did not apologize for asking at all. He asked whether she knew how to mend fence, whether she could stand a full day's work in weather, whether she'd ever handled livestock alone. That single set of questions changed 2 lives, though neither of them understood yet how far the changing would go. The town's version of the story took about 4 days to set, the way a bad plaster does, cracked already, but nobody willing to redo it. The version went like this. Levi Carter, drowning in his dead father's debts, had married the biggest woman in the county because she was the last one left who'd have him, or the last one left he could stand to look at across a supper table, or, in the meaner tellings, because he needed an ox that could sign her name. Eleanor heard every version. She had long practiced not letting her face answer for her. The truth, when Levi finally gave it to her, was plainer and stranger than any of it. "There's a deadline," he told her. "The second week. sitting across the kitchen table with his father's ledger open between them like a wound that wouldn't close. Deed says the ranch passes clean to me if there's a husband and wife on the property inside the year. My father wrote it that way before he died. I don't rightly know why. If I miss the date, distant cousins in Ohio can contest the whole thing in court, and courts favor people who can afford lawyers. I can't afford a lawyer. I can afford a marriage. So you needed any wife? Eleanor said. Flat. Testing him. I needed the right one. He didn't soften it, didn't dress it up. I asked around before I asked you. 3 other women in this county can do a day's ranch work without help. I picked the one who does it without complaint and without being asked twice. That wasn't charity, Eleanor. That was arithmetic. It was not a romantic answer. It was, Eleanor thought, turning it over that night in the narrow bed in the room that had been his mother's, the first honest answer anyone had given her about why they wanted her for anything. Not despite her size. Because of the work in her hands. The town believed he'd settled. The audience watching this unfold from the outside believed it too, for a while. They were both wrong, and neither of them yet knew it. The ranch itself told its own story. If you knew how to read fence line the way Eleanor had learned to read it growing up on her father's smaller spread 2 counties over. 3 weeks in, walking the north pasture with a coil of wire over her shoulder, she found 40 feet of fence down in a stretch that made no sense for weather damage. The posts weren't rotted. The wire wasn't rusted through. It had been cut, clean, deliberate, close to the post where a wolf or a falling branch would never reach. She brought a length of it back to the house and laid it on the table in front of Levi like evidence in a courtroom. Wolves, he said, not quite looking at the cut ends. Wolves don't carry shears, Eleanor said. And wolves don't cut fence in a straight line 8 inches off the ground on a night with no moon. 3 nights running. Always on the section nearest the county road. He was quiet a long moment. You've been counting the nights. Somebody's been coming onto this land after dark, she said. I'd rather know why than pretend it's teeth. He didn't have an answer for her, not that night. But something in his face told her this wasn't the first strange thing he'd noticed, and decided not to look at too closely. The dead alone might explain a struggling ranch. It didn't explain a ranch someone seemed determined to make fail faster than dead alone would manage. For the first time since she'd arrived, Eleanor understood that surviving this arrangement would take more than strong hands and a willingness to work sunup to sundown. Someone, somewhere, wanted the Carter ranch to collapse, and wanted it badly enough to ride out at night and do the collapsing themselves. The old blacksmith shed behind the barn had been standing empty since Levi's father's hands got too stiff to work it, full of cobweb and a bellows gone dry-rotted at the seams. Eleanor found it while looking for scrap iron to patch the cut fence, and she stood in the doorway a long moment before she said anything to Levi about what she saw there. My father was a smith before the drought took the farm, she said finally. He taught me to forge the way some fathers teach their sons. I was 12 the first time I made a hinge that held. Levi looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door somebody's just handed him the key to. You never said. Nobody ever asked what I could build. Only ever asked what I looked like doing it. She rebuilt the bellows herself over 4 days, patched the forge's cracked lining with clay she dug and fired herself. And by the 2nd week had produced hinges, wagon tongue braces, and a set of branding irons clean enough that Tom Ashby from the neighboring spread rode over just to look at them twice. Where'd you get work like this done? Ashby asked Levi, turning a hinge over in his hands like he didn't quite believe the joinery. My wife made it, Levi said, and Eleanor, hearing it through the open shed door, found she had to set down her hammer for a moment before her hands would work steady again. Neighbors began arriving after that, not to look at the woman too big for a wedding dress, but to place orders. Fence latches, plow parts, a set of fire irons for the Hendersons' new hearth. For the first time in Eleanor's life, wagons pulled up a lane looking for her by name, and it did something to the set of her shoulders that 4 months of marriage vows never could have managed on their own. The Valley's opinion of her was changing, one iron hinge at a time, whether the Valley meant for it to or not. It was while repacking the forged chimney with fresh clay, testing each stone for looseness before she sealed it, that Eleanor's hand found a gap where no gap should be, a stone set shallow, and behind it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a folded letter sealed with wax that had never been broken. She carried it to the house without opening it. Some things, she understood, belonged to the man whose father had written them, not to the wife 3 months into a marriage of arithmetic. Levi's hands were not steady when he broke the seal. The letter was short, the handwriting of a man in failing health, dated less than a month before he died. If anyone offers to buy this land quickly, the letter read, in full, refuse. Refuse no matter the price. There is more under this ground than cattle ever grazed on top of it. I have said too little to you while I had the strength to say more. Forgive me for the silence. Do not sell. No explanation beyond that. No named threat. No named buyer. Nothing but a dying man's warning folded into a chimney wall like he hadn't trusted it to a drawer or a desk. He never talked like a man with secrets, Levi said, staring at his father's hand on the page. He talked like a man protecting one, Eleanor said. Whatever the Carter ranch was worth, it was worth more than the ledger of debts sitting on the kitchen table suggested. And somebody, it seemed, had known that long before Eleanor ever walked its fence lines counting cut wire in the dark. The weeks between the letter in the chimney and the banker's second visit, the ranch did not pause to let its owners solve a mystery. Cattle still needed moving, fence still needed mending, and the ordinary weight of a working spread pressed down on both of them regardless of what secret sat folded in a drawer. A hard frost caught calves out in the north pasture before either of them thought to bring the herd in closer. Eleanor was breaking ice on the trough before dawn when Levi found her, already 3 troughs in, and instead of offering to take the axe from her, he fetched a second one from the shed and worked the far trough without being asked. You don't wait to be told what needs doing, he said, when they met back at the gate. Waiting costs a calf its feet in this cold, Eleanor said. I've broken enough ice in my life to know when a thing can't keep. Levi noticed the exchange more than he let on. Small evidence, filed away, of a marriage becoming something built out of matched effort rather than one person's obligation to the other. The forge orders had grown past what Eleanor could manage alone by then, and she'd begun teaching Levi the bellows and tongs in the evenings, mostly by lamplight, mostly in comfortable near silence. You're a poor apprentice, she told him, honestly, the first time he ruined a hinge by quenching it too soon. I've been called worse, Levi said, and reached for another bar of stock without being asked to try again. He was better company than student, in truth, and it was waiting on iron to heat one of those evenings that he asked her something she hadn't expected. Your father, Levi said. He teach you anything besides the forge? Patience, Eleanor said, and that a hinge that squeaks was never finished properly to begin with. He used to say a man who cuts corners on something nobody will ever see is the same man who'll cut corners on something everybody will. Sounds like a man worth listening to. He was, she said. He'd have liked you. Might have taken some convincing on the arithmetic part, but he'd have liked you. Levi didn't answer that directly. He only nodded once, the way a man nods when he's been handed something he means to keep, and went back to watching the color rise in the iron. It was the closest either of them had come, in 3 months of marriage, to saying something neither was ready to name. The banker's second visit came the following week, and this time Elias Whitcomb, who had been pressing Levi toward foreclosure since spring thaw, did not come to press for it. He wrote out himself instead of sending the usual notice by post, and word of a hidden letter, it seemed, did not stay hidden in a county that small for long. He was smiling in a way Eleanor had not seen from him before. Bankers who smile without being asked a question are worth watching closely, her father used to say, and she had never forgotten it. I've reconsidered the terms, Whitcomb said, laying new papers on the table Eleanor had scrubbed that morning. Full extension, reduced interest. All you need to do is sign over the mineral and water rights as security. Standard practice, you understand, given the size of the debt. Levi, worn down by months of ledgers that never balanced, looked ready to reach for the pen. Eleanor put her hand flat on the papers before he could. Water rights weren't part of any debt agreement you offered in the spring, she said. Why now? Whitcomb's smile thinned. A generous man doesn't ask to have his generosity questioned, Mrs. Carter. A generous man doesn't usually change his mind about foreclosure inside of a week, she answered, unless somebody's told him something about this land he didn't know in the spring. Levi did not sign that day. Whitcomb rode off with his new papers and signed, and his smile gone entirely, and Eleanor stood at the window watching him go, certain now that the letter in the chimney and the banker's sudden generosity were not two separate mysteries, but one. Mrs. Pruitt arrived on a gray Tuesday with a bolt of fabric across her arms and an expression Eleanor had never once seen her wear. The look of a woman who has been rehearsing an apology the whole ride over and still isn't sure the words will come out right. "I lied to you," Mrs. Pruitt said, before Eleanor had even set down the bucket she was carrying. "There was never a pattern problem. I can cut for any shape God made. I've been sewing 30 years. The Ashby wives and the Hendersons and half the church board came to me before you ever did and said plainly they wouldn't attend a wedding if the dress in it came out of my shop fitted to you. I was afraid of losing their custom. I chose my ledger over your wedding, and I have not slept easy about it since." Eleanor stood very still. It was one thing to be refused by a stranger's silent judgment. It was another thing entirely to learn the refusal had names attached, names she'd sat near in church, names whose children she'd waved to on the road. "I'll cut it for nothing," Mrs. Pruitt said. "No charge, however long it takes to get right. It's the least owed, and it isn't near enough." Eleanor did not answer at once. She thought of the mirror she'd told herself she'd never stand in front of again, and found, standing in her own kitchen with a woman offering late honesty in place of a wedding dress, that the refusal no longer felt like the last word on the matter. "I'll think on it," she said, which was as much forgiveness as she had ready to give that day, and Mrs. Pruitt seemed to understand that was more than she'd come expecting. Levi found her afterwards sitting on the porch step with the folded fabric still in her lap, not crying, just still in a way that worried him more than tears would have. "You don't have to wear it if it doesn't sit right with you," he said, easing down onto the step beside her, careful of the space between them the way he always was. "Nobody's owed a dress, least of all one that comes wrapped in an apology. It's not the dress." Eleanor turned the fabric over once in her hands. "It's that I spent 4 months hating a shop, when the whole time it was people I know, people I've passed bread to at church suppers. It's easier to be refused by strangers, Levi. Harder to find out it was neighbors all along." He didn't try to talk her out of the hurt. He only sat with her until the porch went from gray to gold, and when he finally stood to start the morning chores, he left his hand resting on her shoulder a moment longer than the leaving required. Neither of them mentioned it afterward. Eleanor found she didn't need him to. The barn stove got lit before first light most mornings, because cattle didn't care what hour a person felt like starting, and it was in that hour, dark outside, one lamp burning, coffee just past the point of scalding, that Eleanor and Levi had fallen into a habit neither of them had planned or named. He was always down first, forking hay before she arrived. She always brought 2 cups instead of 1, because somewhere in the second month it had stopped feeling strange to assume he'd want it. "Cold snap coming," Levi said, this particular morning, nodding at the sky through the open barn door where the stars still sat sharp and close. "Can feel it in the fence posts. Copper wire's brittle in this cold," Eleanor said. "I'll bring extra to the south stretch today, in case last night wasn't wolves again either." Neither of them laughed at that anymore. It had stopped being a joke about a month back. They drank the coffee mostly in silence, the good kind, the kind that didn't need filling. It was Levi who broke it, eventually, turning his cup slow in his hands. "You forge like your father taught you," he said. "But you carry yourself like somebody taught you to expect the room to be too small for you before you even walked in. Who taught you that?" Eleanor considered several answers she'd given other people over the years, all of them shorter and less true than what she said instead. "Everyone did, Levi. A little at a time, since I was tall enough to bump my head on a doorframe at 9 years old. Nobody taught it to me on purpose. It just accumulated." He didn't offer sympathy, which she was grateful for, because sympathy from Levi always came out sounding like an apology for something he hadn't done. Instead, he reached into his coat and set something small on the bench between them, a flat piece of scrap iron, one of her own hinges from the first batch she'd forged, the metal gone a little blue from the fire. "Keep this in your apron," he said. "Not for luck, just so you've got something in your pocket you made with your own hands, on a day somebody makes you forget you did." It was not a declaration. It was not romantic, not by the measure of any story Eleanor had grown up hearing. But she put the hinge in her apron pocket that morning and found, 3 weeks later, that she still hadn't taken it out. It was another dawn, weeks after, before she told him the rest of it, the part underneath the part about door frames and dressmakers. I was engaged once, she said, watching the stove rather than him. Before you. A farmer's son from the next county, decent enough, or seemed it. We were 3 weeks from the church when he called it off. Why? He heard men joking in the feed store that his children would come out giants. Her voice did not shake saying it, which had taken years of practice. He laughed along with them before he thought about who might hear it. Somebody told me anyway. He never denied it when I asked. You still think about him? I burned every letter he ever wrote me. She reached inside her collar and drew out a small, worn envelope she'd carried against her skin for longer than she let most people know. Except this one. I keep it in my Bible. Not because I love him. Because I need something to remind me not to trust a kind word too quickly, not until it's been tested. Levi didn't reach for the letter. He didn't ask to read it. He only said, after a long quiet, I won't ask you to burn that one. But I hope someday you don't need it anymore. And went back to forking hay before the silence could turn into something either of them would have to name too soon. The stranger who rode into the valley that spring called himself Charles Redding, and within 2 weeks half the county had decided he was the most agreeable man to cross the state line in years. He paid fair prices for struggling neighbors' land. He fronted seed money to the Hendersons after their well went dry. He tipped his hat to every woman in town, Eleanor included, and never once let his eyes linger the way lesser men did. Eleanor did not trust him from the first handshake. I've seen his face before, she told Levi, the night after Redding had toured the valley shaking hands. Not him exactly. His father. There was a railroad man come through my home county years back. Same easy manner, same fair prices, and inside 3 years he owned every water right within 20 miles, and the farmers who sold to him were working his land as tenants instead of their own as owners. Levi went still. You think he's connected to the letter? I think he already owns nearly every ranch bordering yours, Eleanor said. And I think this is the only spread left standing between him and something he wants badly enough to smile at strangers for a year running to get it. The mystery that had started as a torn fence and a hidden letter had grown, in the space of one conversation, into something far larger than one struggling ranch and one desperate marriage. Somewhere underneath the Carter land was the reason a railroad fortune had sent its smiling son to buy up a whole valley one fair handshake at a time. Within a month, Eleanor's suspicion had evidence to stand on. The Hendersons sold their spread to Redding at what looked like a generous price, and inside 2 weeks were working the same land as tenants under a lease with terms nobody had explained clearly before the ink dried. The Ashbys held out, and found their credit at the feed store abruptly harder to come by, though no one there would say why aloud. Small things, each explainable alone. Together, they made a shape Eleanor recognized from her childhood county, the same shape a railroad man's fortune had left behind there 20 years before. He's patient, Eleanor told Levi, watching Redding's buggy pass along the county road for the 3rd time that week, unhurried, tipping his hat to a woman hanging wash. He doesn't need to threaten anybody. He just needs everybody around this ranch to run out of choices before you do. And if I run out of choices first, then he doesn't need the fence cut anymore, she said. He just needs you tired enough to sign. Levi did not answer that night, but she saw him afterward walking the property line alone at dusk, hand resting now and again on posts that had already been mended twice that season, and understood he had heard her plainly enough not to need the words repeated. Turning point 9, the worst decision Levi ever made. Harvest was 3 weeks out and the debt was still due in full when Whitcomb returned a second time, this time without smiling at all, and laid out numbers that made even Eleanor's steady hands go still on the table edge. Redding, it turned out, had quietly bought the note on Levi's debt from the bank itself. The offer that followed was simple and merciless. Sell the ranch outright, at a price fair enough to clear every debt and leave a little besides, or face a foreclosure timeline Redding's lawyers had already begun drawing up. Levi did not tell Eleanor that night. He told himself he was protecting her from a decision that wasn't really a decision at all, that a man ought to carry the worst of a burden himself rather than hand his wife half of an impossible choice. He rode to town 3 days later and signed a preliminary agreement of sale, meaning to tell her once harvest was in and there was nothing left to lose by the telling. She found the papers by accident, folded into the ledger she was balancing on a rain-soaked Thursday, Redding's signature already inked above the line where Levi's waited. Her hands did not shake. That was the strange part. the parts she would remember after, how steady her own fingers stayed, turning the page over once to be sure, while something else in her chest went down like a wall giving way all at once. No warning, no groan first. She did not shout. She had never shouted in her life and did not intend to start over a piece of paper. She packed a single bag instead, methodically, the way she did everything, and was standing by the door with it when Levi came in from the south pasture, hat still in his hand, mud still on his boots, no idea yet what he was walking into. "You were going to let me find out after it was already done," she said. It was not a question. He saw the bag before he saw her face, and whatever he'd meant to say died somewhere on the way to his mouth. "I was trying to protect you from a decision I already knew the answer to," he said. "You decided I wasn't owed the choosing." Eleanor's voice stayed level, which cost her more than raising it would have. "That's a different thing than protecting, Levi, and I think you know it." She did not say the rest of it, not that night. That this was the exact shape of every refusal she'd swallowed her whole life, dressed up now in a husband's good intentions instead of a dressmaker's excuses, but no less a decision made about her without her in the room. "Eleanor, I'm not leaving tonight," she said, cutting off whatever apology he'd started building. "But I want you to understand what almost happened here. You almost let a stranger decide what this land was worth without once asking what it was worth to me." She did not leave that night, but she slept in the room that had been his mother's, and neither of them spoke more than the ranch required for 4 days running. And the audience watching this unfold had every reason to wonder whether an arrangement built on arithmetic could survive what honesty had just cost it. The work did not stop for the silence between them, and in its way the work was what kept the marriage from breaking outright. The Hendersons arrived on the second day with 2 wagons of neighbors to help bring in what hay could still be cut before the weather turned. Word having spread that the Carter place was in trouble again, though nobody outside the house yet knew what kind. Eleanor worked the fields alongside Tom Ashby's wife and 3 of the younger Henderson boys, without once explaining why her husband worked the far end of the same field and neither of them crossed to speak to the other. "Man looks like he's carrying something heavier than hay bales," Mrs. Ashby said quietly, passing Eleanor a dipper of water at midday. "He is," Eleanor said, and did not elaborate, and Mrs. Ashby, being a woman who had buried 1 husband and outlasted the foolishness of a second, did not press her. It was on the 3rd night, doing the accounts alone at the kitchen table because the numbers no longer felt like something to share, that Eleanor found the second paper folded behind the first, Redding's private note to Levi, promising a further payment above the sale price if certain water rights language was left deliberately vague in the final contract. Levi, it turned out, had not simply been protecting her from a hard decision. He had been offered money to make a decision that would have quietly handed Redding exactly what the old letter in the chimney had warned against, and either he had not understood what he was signing or had chosen, in his exhaustion, not to look closely enough to find out. She confronted him with it the next morning, not gently. "Did you know what you were agreeing to?" she said. "Or did you simply not want to know?" "I didn't read it as carefully as I should have," Levi admitted, and the admission cost him visibly, a man forced to see his own tiredness as a kind of failure rather than an excuse. "I wanted the debt gone. I wanted it gone bad enough I stopped asking what the getting gone would cost." "That's the difference between us, then," Eleanor said. "I've never once in my life had the luxury of not asking what a thing costs before I agreed to it." He did not argue the point. He spent the next 2 days repairing fence alone in weather that would have kept most men indoors, and Eleanor understood, watching him from the kitchen window, that this was the only apology he currently had the words to give her. The same arithmetic he'd offered from the start, translated now into hours of hard labor instead of hard honesty. On the 3rd evening, she brought coffee out to him at the fence line without being asked, the first time she'd sought him out since finding the papers. He took the cup with hands raw from cold wire, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, just stood together watching the light go copper over the ridge. "I'm not finished being angry," Eleanor said finally, "but I don't want to spend it out here in the cold with you freezing over a fence that's already mended twice." "Fair enough," Levi said, and when she turned to walk back to the house, he fell into step beside her without either of them deciding it out loud. It was not forgiveness yet. It was only 2 people choosing, again, to walk the same direction. The storm that rolled through on the 5th night carried real lightning, the kind that split an old cottonwood down by the creek with a crack loud enough to wake the whole valley. By the time Eleanor was in the yard with a bucket, the hay barn was already burning past saving, and for one terrible half-second she believed, along with everyone else who would later hear the story, that the sky itself was to blame. Then she saw where the flames sat lowest and brightest, not along the roofline where lightning strikes, but low along the walls, spread in a pattern no bolt from the sky had ever made. Someone had carried oil onto the property. Levi was already moving toward the door before she could get the words out, shouting something about the deed and his father's letter, both still inside the small strongbox where he kept the ranch's only proof of ownership free and clear of Redding's paperwork. She grabbed for his arm and missed, and watched him vanish into smoke thick enough to swallow a manhole. The roof went not 30 seconds later, a groan, and then a collapse that sent sparks 50 feet into the rain-heavy dark. Every strange thing that had happened since Eleanor arrived on this ranch, the cut fences, the banker's sudden kindness, the smiling stranger buying up a whole valley, arranged itself in her mind in the space of a single held breath, and she understood, with a clarity that left no room for panic, that none of it had ever been separate. It had all been leading here. What the valley would talk about for years afterward was the sight of Eleanor Vance Carter walking out of a collapsing barn with her husband slung across her shoulders like a sack of grain, smoke pouring off both of them, her strength the one thing in that yard that hadn't failed. That much was true, and it was enough on its own to change how the town looked at her. But it was not the whole of what she carried out. Tucked beneath her free arm, wrapped in the same oilcloth that had once held his father's letter, was a small iron strongbox she had grabbed from beneath a loose floorboard on her way past the forge, a box Levi's father had shown her once, in a rare, unguarded moment, without ever fully explaining what it held. Inside, once the smoke cleared and steady hands could open it safely, were survey maps 20 years old, showing in a surveyor's careful hand the path of an underground spring running beneath the whole of the Carter land, the only reliable water source for 30 miles in any direction, in a country where every neighboring well had run dry or thin in the last 3 summers running. Redding's company had never wanted cattle land. Cattle land was easy to find and cheap to buy. They had wanted water, the one thing that made every other ranch they already owned worth anything at all, and the Carter spread was the only piece of ground standing between them and controlling it entirely. Every strange kindness, every sudden offer, every night of cut fence made sense at once, and the audience realized, along with Eleanor, that they had been watching the wrong mystery unfold the whole time. Levi came out of the smoke coughing, his eyebrows singed and one hand burned along the palm where a falling brace had caught him, but alive, and for the first hour afterward that was the only fact Eleanor let herself hold on to. She sat with him on the porch steps while Doc Ferris wrapped the burn, the barn still smoldering 30 yards off, embers drifting up into a sky finally clearing of storm. "You came back for me," Levi said, quiet, watching the last of the roof beams collapse in on themselves. "After everything I did, you still came in after me." "I didn't come in for you," Eleanor said, and let the silence sit a moment before she softened it. "I came in because leaving you in there wasn't a decision I was willing to let the fire make for me, any more than I was willing to let Redding's papers make it. Some things don't get decided without me in the room, Levi. Not the ranch. Not you either, apparently." He looked down at his bandaged hand rather than at her. "I was wrong. About the papers. About all of it." "I know," she said. "You already told me that with 2 days of fence mending. I heard it. I'm only now telling you I did." It was not a reconciliation with a speech in it. No grand apology delivered on one knee. Nothing the county gossips would have found dramatic enough to repeat. It was 2 tired, smoke-stained people sitting on a porch step in the last hour before dawn, and somewhere in the quiet between them, the 4 days of silence finally ended without either of them having to name the ending out loud. Eleanor reached over, careful of the bandage, and closed her hand around his good one, and they sat like that until the sky went from black to gray, without either one suggesting they ought to go inside. The maps, the letter, and sworn testimony from 2 of Redding's own surveyors, quietly gathered by a circuit judge who had no love for railroad money buying up his district, were enough to bring the fraud into open court by the first hard frost. The ruling came down in Levi's favor, The sale agreement voided for having been signed under a debt Redding's own company had manufactured through the bank it secretly controlled. The ranch stayed Carter land, clear and unencumbered, for the first time since the old man's death. The valley began rebuilding that winter, together, in the plain, unglamorous way frontier towns rebuild. Barn raisings, shared timber, women bringing food to houses still smelling of smoke. On the morning of the wedding neither of them had ever properly had, Eleanor unfolded the dress Mrs. Pruitt had finished sewing 3 weeks before. It fit. Not loosely, not with the apologetic extra fabric of a garment let out to accommodate a shape somebody was embarrassed by. It fit the way a thing fits when it was measured honestly from the start, by a woman who had finally taken the trouble to look at what she was actually cutting for instead of what she was afraid other people would say about it. Levi was waiting outside when she stepped onto the porch, and for a moment he only looked at her, the burn scars still dark along the rebuilt barn behind him. "I went looking for a wife who could rebuild a ranch," he said. "I didn't know I was looking for the only person strong enough to carry every part of my life out of a fire, including the parts one never told her I was afraid of losing." The same women who had once watched silently from the window of Mrs. Pruitt's shop stood in the yard now, not whispering, not measuring her against a doorway too small for her. Nobody in that crowd was looking at the size of the dress. They were looking at the woman who had walked through fire twice. Once for a marriage of arithmetic, once for a truth nobody else had been brave enough to see, and come out the second time as somebody the whole valley had finally learned to call by name instead of by size. 3 years on, the Carter spread ran more cattle than it had in Levi's father's best season, watered by a spring the whole valley now shared under an agreement Eleanor herself had helped draft at the kitchen table. The old blacksmith shed had grown into a proper forge with 2 apprentices from town learning the trade at her elbow, one of them a girl of 13 who had been told, more than once, that hammering iron wasn't fitting work for a woman her size. Eleanor still kept one blued iron hinge in her apron pocket most days. She never did explain to the apprentices why, and they never did stop asking. The old letter from the farmer's son who'd once called off a wedding still sat inside her Bible, worn soft at the folds. She had never burned it. She no longer needed to look at it to remember the lesson. She had simply stopped needing the reminder to feel like armor. There is a particular kind of hope that only gets built the slow way, not handed down whole, but forged one hinge at a time, tested in fire before it is trusted to hold weight. Eleanor Vance never did get the wedding a smaller world was willing to imagine for her. She got a harder one, and a truer one, and in the end, a valley that finally measured her by what her hands had built instead of by what her body had never apologized for being. Every dress deserves to be cut by someone willing to look honestly at what they're making. Every person deserves the same. If this is the year you finally stop shrinking to fit a room that was always too small for you to begin with, let this be the story that told you so. If Eleanor's story moved you, hit like and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been told you were too much for something? What gave you the strength to keep going anyway? I read every single comment. Subscribe for more long frontier stories where the ones the world called too big turned out to be exactly the right size.